On this edition of Independent Sources, candidate Trump. How has Donald Trump taken the Republican primaries by storm, and are his politics fracturing the country more than ever before? A special look coming up. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Gary Pierre. He's been called fear-mongering and bigoted. A recent New York Times op-ed even described him as a personal brand promoter who would chase a check over a cliff. Despite these harsh criticisms, Donald Trump is leading his Republican rivals in the primaries, and some statisticians believe that he may be the next president of the United States. So how has he gone from what some have described as a sideshow act to a frontrunner? With me in studio today to discuss this are Baruch Professor Tom Harper and Bronx Community College Associate Adjunct Professor David Karunga, and Daily Beast columnist Barrett Holmes Pittner is joining us via Skype. Gentlemen, welcome. I'll start with you, Mr. Karunga. So who is supporting Donald Trump? Who is at the base of Donald Trump's support?
The general premise of his constituency are the evangelicals and the working class American voters. These are people who are in the GOP grand coalition. They have the economic conservatives, who are the small clique in the establishment, but then they also have evangelicals and working class whites who support the party for social and cultural reasons: abortion, guns, gay marriage, and their opposition to affirmative action. So these are the issues that evangelicals and working class whites support the GOP for. And these are the people who are supporting Donald Trump. The way he's appealing to these people is he is putting forth a policy that is left of the rest of the Republican Party. He is the most progressive economically among all the Republican candidates. And by appealing to their cultural and social issues, as well as giving them a progressive agenda that will help their pocketbooks, he's winning over a lot of these people away from the economic conservatives in the Republican Party. And as much as they're attacking him, his base of support among that group of people is very solid and will remain so.
Dr. Harper, this group feels it has been neglected. Has it been neglected in the past?
Well, it certainly seems as if it feels that way. These are people, according to opinion surveys, who are ethnocentric. They very much identify with white America and with people they feel have been ignored. I think if you were talking in terms of stereotypes, there's probably the stereotypical Trump supporter would be a factory worker who is concerned about being laid off, or who has had his hours cut back or his benefits diminished. Well, it's mostly men.
Okay.
It's mostly men, as far as I can tell. And one of the interesting things is it seems to be a kind of a mirror opposite with Hillary Clinton, who has difficulty appealing to these kinds of people, but these are the people who seem to be the heart of Mr. Trump's support.
And why do these people think that a billionaire from Park Avenue will have their best interest in mind?
Well, you know, the fact that you have a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that that working class people will not be in your corner. I mean, the classic example is Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was really a member of the what we would call the American aristocracy, and he was known really as the champion of the working class. So the fact that you come from a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that you can't speak for these people. I think one of the things that has surprised many, including me, is the nature of the campaign, because Trump has violated all of the rules, and in a way it reminds me a little bit of Bob Dylan. I remember when Bob Dylan, because I'm an old man.
Yeah, we were dating ourselves.
I know, but I remember when Bob Dylan was coming on the scene, and before Bob Dylan, singers were singers, whether they were Frank Sinatra or Sam Cooke, whoever it was. They were really singers. Mm-hmm. And here's this guy, and he talks in a monotone through his nose. And it turns out that that people love it.
Right.
And he did something radically new. And I think Trump is kind of in the same way. He's paying no attention to the standard approaches. Mm-hmm. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't explain. He makes the most outrageous comments. And he rolls along.
I want to bring Barrett into this. So Barrett, first, I want you to pick up on Professor Harper's point. But first, can you talk about whether or not you think someone who's a billionaire from Park Avenue, who really has no history of working for the working people, working class folks, and does he have their best interests at heart?
Well, I think right now we've always talked about people who statistically have always voted against their own self-interest. I think those people have historically always been lower income white Americans. So, Donald Trump, what he is proclaiming that he would do, or his policies, I really can't say whether those policies would actually benefit low income white Americans to the degree that, we would like a candidate to address his constituency. But this is also a demographic that historically has voted against their own self-interest. So, the fact that he might not be doing what, would be smart for them, probably makes him a bit more appealing because he is presenting to them an authoritative view to give them back a previous type of America where they felt more secure, they felt life was better, whether life was, infinitely better for them or for the the majority of Americans, who knows? But it's clearly what he has is an emotional connection with these people. He speaks not like someone from Park Avenue, like Ted Cruz. He campaigns as being a Texan, and but when he talks, you can tell that he went to Harvard. When Donald Trump talks, it seems as though he's some guy that just hangs out down the street from you, and he's not some billionaire from Park Avenue. We talk about the fact that he is a billionaire, but he campaigns more so as a person who's worked hard and made his own business, and it's really successful. And a low-income, blue-collar white American, that's the rhetoric that they relate to, because they would love to be a Joe Schmo who then creates his own business and becomes a billionaire and can still, talk with regular everyday people. So I think the billionaire Park Avenue aspect of his, persona is not what he presents or projects to this demographic. He projects, I'm a guy just like you. I liked America, back when, and I want to bring it back there. And yeah, I worked hard and I have a business, but I worked hard and got it. I'm not some Park Avenue dilettante who received an allowance from my family to go make billions. That he doesn't present himself as that. So I think one aspect of his appeal, like you referenced my article about Donald Trump's economic appeal to low-income whites, I think a lot of it is, and this goes to white Americans, low-income ones, historically voting against their own self-interest, ties into the capital, the economic opportunity, the life opportunities you got in America just because you were white. The American dream was more accessible to white Americans than it was for many other Americans for a long time. And this demographic, white Americans seem to be a bit more frustrated now due to the democratic infrastructures of America opening up opportunities for more immigrants, more African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos to achieve the American dream. And so the dream that these low-income white Americans expected to get, that their parents may have gotten a bit more easier than they got or whatnot, makes them a bit more frustrated. And someone that is appealing to them and saying, hey, I worked hard and made my own business and I understand your pain. They relate to him quite a bit. But there's a lot of subtle economic, racial dynamics that are kind of the backbone of America that we're only now as a society really trying to address equitably.
We're due for our first break now. Stay tuned for more on our discussion about candidate Trump. Thanks for staying tuned to a special look at Donald Trump and his candidacy. Barrett, I want to start with you. This question, we want to pick up with this point about the Tea Party. How much of a role do you think the Tea Party has played in the rise of Donald Trump, the candidate?
Well, I think it's played a pretty significant role, but not a direct, like an indirect role. I think the rise of the Tea Party following Obama's election allowed the Republican Party to shift a bit more to the right. Like the Bush administration's policy for elections in like 2000, 2008 were focusing on like evangelicals and more right-leaning votes instead of moderate voters and trying to sway people from like the Democrat side to become Republican. Like if you look back in the late 90s, like most campaigns revolved around trying to get moderate voters who were either going to sway Democrat or Republican. But in 2000, the Republican Party focused more on like just every bit of the right leaning voters, and then the Tea Party kind of took that to an even further trajectory where like you had far right leaning evangelicals where they kind of broke free from traditional conservative orthodoxies and focused more like on family values and all these different types of issues, and they were looking for candidates who weren't your run-of-the-mill establishment candidates. So many new Tea Party candidates who didn't fit within the precise Republican mold were able to become significant people. In this election cycle, we had Ted Cruz and Rand Paul who wouldn't identify themselves as like traditional Republicans. Donald Trump has been a candidate who's been able to rise because this new infrastructure has become and grown into importance. That's why people were curious as to what he would say, and they would let him go on Fox News and talk radio and all these right-leaning conservative outlets. And then next thing you know, we had the birther movement came out, which is a more far right-leaning movement talking about not traditional fiscal conservatism and stuff like that. And Donald Trump,
the birther movement is his quest to show that President Obama was not an American, was not born in America. For people who don't know what the birther movement is.
Right, exactly. And that movement, that crazy quest, it was a very far right-leaning movement that now found a place within like the Republican umbrella, because as a party, they weren't looking to get moderate voters. They were looking to get far right voters who may not traditionally vote, and Donald Trump fit within that. He was given a platform to speak because of the Tea Party, a further platform to speak because of the birther movement. Fox News gave him more platforms to speak because he's entertaining and all sorts of stuff like that. And it really gave him a good 7 years of prep to learn how to like manipulate and maneuver this system without being a part of the system. And the Tea Party, which looks for people who aren't establishment candidates, who aren't part of the establishment, they championed people who don't have experience. And so Donald Trump was able to get the experience of how this political system works, how to appeal to people, what networks to be on, get the Rolodex, all that kind of stuff. So that when he did decide to run, he knew how to do it. So I think the Tea Party kind of gave him the framework to formulate whether he could or couldn't run for president, and now he has. And everyone seems to be astonished at how well he's manipulated it. But, if you give anybody about 7 years worth of prep on something, they'll be pretty good.
Yeah, indeed. So, Dr. Halpert, I want to ask you, is economics the only thing at stake for these people?
Well,
for the Trump
supporters? I think the surveys indicate that economics is the central issue for them. Economic fear, economic anxiety, economic resentment. I guess my own feeling is that although Trump may talk like a regular guy, he continually reminds everybody that he's very rich. So it isn't as if he's pretending to be a regular guy. He's not at all. He may talk like a regular guy, but he keeps coming back and saying, look how rich I am. And I think he does that, first of all, because I think money is connected with brains as an assumption. You've heard the old wisecrack, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And so he's saying, I am rich and therefore I am smart. And then he takes it a step further and says, how did I make my money? I made my money doing deals. And doing deals is something that presidents should do, and I am the great deal doer. Obama isn't a deal doer, Bush wasn't a deal doer, but this is what I do. So he's kind of redefined the role and the office of the presidency so that it fits the persona that he has built for himself. And I think he's done it skillfully. So I don't feel that he's only presenting himself as an ordinary guy. he's presenting himself as someone who talks in ordinary language, but he's very much presenting himself as a very rich man. And I think his riches are really the basis of, his riches really legitimate what he's trying to do.
David, same question. Is economics the only thing, or is there, do working or poor whites feel a sense of losing their stature in America? Is that part of it as well? That they're not better than the blacks, they're not better than the Latinos, they're not better than the Asians. Who can you be better than?
They have been struggling for a while, and they are struggling as well as other people in the country. And what you see these voters that Trump is getting is a lot of them I'm seeing are torn between either supporting Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And if you see where Sanders is doing very well in, he's doing very well in these working class white states where primarily is, and he and Trump are really competing for some of the same voters. The issue with Sanders is Sanders isn't giving them that culturally conservative, social conservative message that Trump, that pro-gun, Christian conservative message. So culturally and socially, Sanders isn't in line with them. Economically, he is. What Trump is doing is he's giving them that economic and that cultural and social, and that's what is galvanizing them. He's really a candidate for the first time that's built for them. And I don't feel that his voters are, them voting for him is that surprising. I think it was more surprising that they were supporting these neocons and these economic conservatives.
Well, they felt that they didn't have a choice, right? Who else are they going to support?
Essentially. But that's what they've been doing for years, and that's actually hurt their pocketbooks. Finally, they have a guy like Trump who is giving them this message. And this is really where, this is the kryptonite for Trump. This is where he's most vulnerable. He is vulnerable on the issues. You can attack him up all day long about the rhetoric that he's, and people have been doing that, and it's not working. But he's really vulnerable on these issues, where if you attack this notion that he is the best person to fix our trade issues, he is the best person to fix the economy and to create jobs, then you're going to catch the attention of his voters, because that's the real reason why they're backing him. And from the left particularly, he's vulnerable if you attack his issues, and really nobody has done that effectively. Nobody's really even tried to attack him. They've been distracted by the headline grabbing rhetoric, and that's not really why his voters are so firmly behind him. I think really it is an economic thing, because among the GOP, he really is hijacking their whole support base and pulling them to the left. And what he's showing is the GOP is not as conservative as you think they are, and even the Tea Party voters, they're not as conservative as you think they are, because Trump isn't conservative economically. He's just conservative socially and culturally. Economically, it's a toss-up. He's really more liberal than Republicans are comfortable with. This is probably why a lot of the establishment in the party are dead set against him, because he's revolting against their whole economic conservative agenda.
Barrett, I'd like for you to weigh on this question as well.
No problem. Frankly, I think we talk a lot about Trump's ideology, thus far in this conversation, and Trump's ideology is frankly, I'm Donald Trump, I think I'm great at things, so just let me do what I think makes the most sense to me. That doesn't align with conservative ideologies or liberal ideologies. He's just going to pick and choose whatever he wants. This makes him a very unpredictable candidate, and that's why the Republicans are, getting frustrated, not because he's breaking away. It's like he was never a part of it. He's just taking what he wants and using it however he wants. The economic appeal that he's giving to conservative voters, I think it's a false appeal, because he hasn't laid out any precise plans, and even if he does, a lot of this electorate aren't the people that look at these precise plans. They're going after an emotional connection, someone who says that I care about your financial difficulties. But we also acknowledge that low-income white Americans are the voters who historically have always economically voted against their own self-interest. So their economic appeal, it's kind of just an emotional attachment to who they feel could create something that they might like. But it's too wishy-washy, and that's why the GOP historically has always been able to take advantage of this group, because they know they're going to vote for them, and they know they don't need to make policies that actually benefit their lives. Donald Trump is taking this approach too. The thing that's interesting between Trump and Sanders is Sanders is clearly the more emotional candidate on the Democratic side that invokes support because people feel his frustration. Hillary Clinton just hasn't been able to resonate in that way. But the model that Bernie Sanders is telling Americans that he wants to create is not an American model. He's trying to get ideas, socialism and other concepts from like Denmark and Scandinavia, and getting America to acquiesce to some foreign idea that will make their world better. Like a lot of conservative people who aren't, really that great fond of international travel or non-American ideas, especially the word socialism, which they connect to communism, are not going to resonate with that idea. Donald Trump, on the other hand, he's going to say the economics that America had in the past were great, and I support those. Don't you want these that you're more familiar with? And they're going to they're going to connect with those. The big issue, though, is America economically has always been based around like a large amount of income inequality. There has been like white Americans historically have always had far greater economic opportunities than African Americans, Asians, Latinos, and especially also like first-time immigrant white Americans that like hadn't fully ingratiated themselves in like the white American economy. So this like there becomes like a weird racial division concerning Trump's economic policies, because white Americans are definitely, if he does what he says he intends to do, which we don't have any track record or foundation to believe that's actually what's going to happen, because we know he just does what he thinks makes sense for himself at that time, regardless of whether it's like a liberal or conservative ideology, it's going to stoke a racial division, because if he does what he says he's going to do, it's definitely going to benefit white Americans a tad bit more than blacks if he's trying to take America's economic policy to the past and not to the future or someplace else.
All right. So we'll be right back with some final thoughts from our guest. Welcome back. So, David, can Donald Trump win
I think that
the general election? Right?
I think he can win the nomination, and I think he can win the general election, unless, of course, Hillary Clinton has maybe Sanders at the bottom of her ticket to kind of pull away some of these working class white voters. He definitely can beat her if she doesn't have it. I don't think he can beat Bernie Sanders or Clinton with Sanders, but if he's just go up against Clinton, he has a chance.
Same question now to Dr. Halper. Well, who should Trump, if it's a nominee for the Republican Party, choose as a VP candidate to balance some of the vitriol?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. All the data show it makes no difference who you choose as vice president. Okay. It doesn't matter. If I could just go back to one point,
of course.
I think that Trump has picked out one policy area, which is globalization, which has been the dominant fact in economic life in the Western world for a long time, and he's kind of declared war on globalization. And it's true he hasn't come up with any precise, detailed policies.
But he has done.
But that makes no difference, because none of these policies that candidates come up with end up being adopted anyway. So I think we should give the devil his due. He has taken on a very important issue, globalization. He's come up with his answer, which people have a general idea of what it is, and it seems to be very appealing to this large number of individuals who, for a variety of reasons, socially and economically, feel threatened. I don't think he's going to be elected president. Okay. I don't.
As far as running mates, though, I think it would be interesting. Susana Martinez, the Republican governor of New Mexico, two-term. If he picks her, he could clean up some of those problems that he's having. It's possible.
Okay. Barrett, can Trump win, and what does he need to do to win the general election?
This election cycle has been kind of crazy so you're not going to rule it out. I think I doubt that he will. The big issue about America concerning elections is we don't actually vote that much as a people. Like, white Americans are the largest voting bloc, and we only 65% of white Americans vote. So if he gets like a large swath of white Americans who didn't vote to vote, then, he's going to have a pretty legitimate chance. But if the Democrats do what they did in 2012 and 2008, to do the same thing that they've done, they're going to have a large enough voting bloc and a large enough swing states to win the nomination. It's just making sure you get the people to show up. The Latino vote also is going to be the big surprise package. I think the Democrats have a pretty substantial lead in getting that electorate to show up in droves, and Trump's not doing himself any favors with the wall talk. So I think numerically the Democrats just have the numbers. Trump's just a bit louder and like physically dangerous as a candidate. Who he picks for a VP, I don't care.
I want you to weigh in on that. I mean, can he mathematically win? Trump. Because when you look at it, he's alienated quite a bit of Latinos, immigrants.
Latino turnout rates have been fairly low.
Okay.
Partly because for
They've
age,
never had somebody to galvanize
but
them like
also
this,
for
though.
age reasons, they're a relatively young segment of the population.
And they've never been galvanized this way.
One of the problems that the Democrats have is that Democratic voters tend to be clustered in certain areas. So the Democrats may be able to run up the score, say, in a state like New York, but you only get what you get. You carry New York and you get all the New York voters, but everything above 50% plus one is really wasted. So the Democratic voters tend to be more clustered, and therefore the Democrats really tend to waste a lot of voters, many more voters than the Republicans do.
So here's the big thing when it comes to like voting in the U.S. It's a fact. Historically, white Americans have been like the people who have consistently voted time and time again because they're the ones that were allowed to vote the most. But that as like America changes demographically and there's like larger segments of Latinos and Asian Americans and African Americans dispersed throughout the country, how many times does this voting bloc need to vote over election cycles to be taken seriously? Like the Latino vote historically has been quite low, but historically there haven't been that many Latinos in America to like come up to get like a 5 presidential election cycle trajectory. Like even African Americans, if you look at it, we've only been voting over 60% over 2 election cycles. But we know white Americans are going to show up at the same numbers. So like the Latino vote, you can't make any like precise estimate that they're going to show up in this amount because they just haven't been eligible to vote nearly as much with this number of people in the country. But they have a very, very large voting bloc that's really mobilized this time around, and they're going to surprise a lot of people. And African Americans, frankly, we showed up at like 67% last time around, and if we can do that again, and we live in like highly like metropolized areas in swing states that are decisive, and so the Democrats have that in their favor, where they have the big underrepresented voting bloc in big concentrated areas that swing states, and they have a Latino population that's only getting larger. That's every day is more inclined to vote Democrat than Republican.
Okay.
Like that's pretty beneficial for the Democrats.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. That's our show this week. Thanks again to Professors Harper and Karenga, and to you, Barrett.
Thanks.
Till next time, be independent-minded.